be starting in just a bit.
All cases, scientists.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. It is officially 4:30 p.m., so we are going to get started. First of all, welcome to the Future of Parking and Mobility Kickoff event. My name is Anita Holman, and I'm the primary contact for the Livable Centers program here at the Houston-Galveston Area Council. As you may know, livable centers are places where people can live, work, and play with less reliance on their cars. They encourage a complementary mix of land uses that are designed to be walkable, connected, and accessible by multiple modes of transportation. Every year, the program hosts a workshop where we target a topic that explores the nexus between land use and transportation. This year, we are excited to host this conversation around parking. Please note this kickoff event is the first of a continued workshop to begin tomorrow, Friday, September 18th at 9 a.m. Agendas for today's event as well as tomorrow's will be posted in the meeting chat. If you have not registered for tomorrow's workshop, we'd like you to, and we will also provide that in the chat box. With that, I hope everyone is feeling relaxed and ready to discuss parking. If you haven't already, be sure to grab a cold drink as we end our day and begin the future of parking. To help us navigate our online platform, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Andrea Tantillo, who is our meeting engineer for this session. Andrea?
Thank you, Anita. First, I want to let everyone know that this meeting is being recorded. During the meeting today, please keep yourself muted and your video off. You can access your mute and your video controls on the far left side of your control bar. We will take questions during the meeting through the chat. You can find that in the middle of your control bar. Next slide, please. If you're using your phone or another device, you can access your mute and video controls in the bottom left of the application, and you can access the chat by clicking on the three little dots on the right at the bottom of the app, which opens a menu, and there you will find the chat. And if you're having trouble muting or turning off your camera, one of the meeting hosts will be happy to take care of that for you. And now I would like to introduce Mike Burns, who will be today's moderator. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you to everyone who's participating, and especially thank you, Anita. Just so everyone knows, Anita did a lot to pull all this together, and those of us who are transportation geeks and policy wonks appreciate her effort in organizing this opportunity to share ideas. I'm excited to discuss the future of parking this evening and to participate in the sessions tomorrow. And just so everyone knows, our video is off until after the presentations, just for quality control, but we'll turn those back on. As mentioned in the biography section of the agenda, I've relocated back to Houston from Nantucket, Massachusetts earlier this year, right at the start of this COVID situation, which was a very fun challenge. As many of you know, Nantucket is a small 45 square mile island just south of Cape Cod. What a lot of you may not know is that little island experiences a lot of the same issues and stresses as major metropolitan or typical suburban and bedroom communities. While working in the community dependent on tourism and second homeowners, I've thought of transportation users as either residents or visitors. And we can all identify with experiencing different areas of our community, our region, or beyond from those roles as we live, work, and play. We all depend on an array of public and private investments in transportation infrastructure to do that safely, efficiently, and with respect to others. And ideally, those investments also contribute to the culture, economy, and our natural environment. Like most industries, transportation and transportation planning is a never-ending cycle of improving the precision of managing inventory, evaluating performance, critiquing ideas, and investing in improvements, and then repeating that. For transportation in our region, the Houston-Galveston Regional Transportation Plan is one of the instruments used in this cycle. Parking, as you know, is part of our inventory of transportation assets. And this workshop, today's session, will help inform that update. Next, please. In what can be a white knuckle, adrenaline-inducing experience, parking is oftentimes where that experience begins and ends. Today's program will start off with a presentation from Brian Lozano of Walter P. Moore that will include a history of accommodating our parking needs, and then look to the future of how facilities can be flexible for evolving needs and utilization, including the diversity of vehicle types and potential reuse of parking facilities. Next, as you know, our public ways are used to meet more demands than just vehicle flow. Maria Ershad of Park Houston will next discuss management of curb space for all users as communities grow and evolve, and how parking management can improve inventory management and accommodate our different payment methods and modes of transportation. Then, recognizing the opportunity to use parking facilities to provide a transition from one mode to another, Priya Zachariah of Metro Houston will be stepping in for Kimberly Williams, who was listed on your agenda. We're happy to have Priya sharing Metro's plan for the future, as she was very much a part of its development. You all may know that METRONext was approved by more than 2/3 of voters almost a year ago and proposes expanding several types of transportation. New and improved parking opportunities and transit centers are part of that plan. Priya will also discuss emerging technologies being used by Metro. And to put all of this together, the final presentation by Lisa Nissenson of WGI will consider the new realities, such as this new e-commerce dynamic, and discuss how scenario planning for evaluating how all this technology and automation could best work for you and benefit your community. We will end with a roundtable with video to answer your questions and discuss other factors that contribute to this topic. So to start it off, I'll hand it over to Brian Lozano, Director of Parking Services at Walter P. Moore.
Thank you, Mike. The focus of this portion of the presentation will be on the future of parking as it relates more to parking facility design. We'll talk a little bit about trends and where we think parking structure design could be headed. Next slide, please. To begin to understand trends, we first must understand where we've been, where we currently are, and then where we see where we might be going. So let's lace up the Nikes, grab the hoverboard, and let's go park to the future. Next slide. So let's start way back in the 1900s. We see one of the first, what we call carriage houses in London. It only had 100 spaces and an electric elevator. It's kind of the first really precursor to the future of parking. Next slide, please. In the 1930s, we see some of our first elevator type garages. They had mechanical lift elevator type systems, and this one may be one of the very first repurposed parking structures. Next slide, please. In the 50s, we see more of a traditional approach to garage design. Basically, self-parking was introduced, vehicular ramps for interfloor travel. Although it wasn't the most efficient parking structure, you could really start to see some of the familiar cues with today's parking garages. Next slide. In the 60s through the 80s, we saw a proliferation of highly efficient office building type garages, very utilitarian in design, pretty much serve one single purpose: to park cars and park them in a concrete box. We also start to see some breakthroughs with long span construction to increase efficiency and, you guessed it, park more cars. Next slide, please. In the next 20-year period, we really see that although efficiency was still a driver, garage design became a little bit smarter. And we really saw this mass adoption of what we call level of service design approach. Next slide. Now we arrive at the modern era of parking structure facility design. We see structures that are part of the community, they're multi-use, integrated with other buildings. Many have sustainable features. Some are part of multimodal and transit-oriented development, and many incorporate technology to increase utilization, enhance wayfinding, provide an overall higher level of service. And finally, we see a recent trend toward adaptable parking structures that can be designed to be repurposed to another use in the future. Next slide. Now let's go into a few modern examples that implement some of these strategies and trends that we spoke about a little earlier. First example is Midtown Park Garage, located here in Houston. This overall project is a great example of how a new development with public space and, of course, parking can become the center of activity in the area. Midtown Garage is underground garage that spans almost the entire 6-acre development, and it provides around 400 parking spaces for a variety of user groups, public, event, commuter parking, because it's adjacent to the Metro McGowan Station Rail, as well as the ability to support future retail on the site. And finally, park and garage design, they work together with on-site water management, which is a sustainable feature for the garage. There's a 70,000 gallon water vault that was built within the garage construction footprint to capture both the park and the garage drainage, and then reuse that for the irrigation of the park. Next slide. Different type of trend we're seeing is parking structures that are part of a transit-oriented development, or in the case of West Park Lower Uptown Transit Center, that are part of a multimodal hub. You have 2 modes of bus service, park and ride coming from the US 59 HOV, and you can see that connection there in the upper left-hand picture. Buses circulate on the 3rd level of the transit center. The lowest level has local bus service, which supports the newly opened Uptown BRT. And then the 2nd level is an integrated commuter parking garage. The transit center also has accommodations in the way it was designed to receive other modes of transportation in the future. Next slide. This project example is one that shows more of an urban trend that we're seeing in the integrated parking with another building type. In this case, it's office tower and retail. Bank of America Tower in downtown Houston has an integrated 1,300 space garage that's both under the tower, what we call a podium type structure, and then a large portion outside the garage footprint or outside the tower footprint. This was done to allow the project to be built in phases. The first phase, which is the standalone garage, it came online a few years before the portion under the tower. And this strategy was used by the developer to start generating revenue sooner. Additionally, the garage has multi-purpose components in it, like a retail on the ground floor, as well as a green patio space on the roof of the garage. Next slide. Next example is a parking structure at the Boulevard Place development in the Uptown area. The garage serves a mixed-use development and utilizes the roof of the garage as a cinema club. Really, really cool idea. Next slide. The final example in using a garage in an integrated fashion within a development is University of Houston Garage 5, which is the Elgin Street Garage. It's 2,500 spaces that serve staff, visitor, student parking needs, but also serves the needs of the new architecture and art school building that was sharing the same footprint of the garage development on the same parcel of land. The multifunction space includes an art gallery and the school's maker space. So you can watch art being made with this glass enclosure that's open to the loop road sidewalk that's adjacent pedestrian realm. Additionally, it utilizes a parking count and guidance system to enhance wayfinding and increased utilization. And then finally, the garage drainage system was designed to flow into a bioswale that supports low impact design for storm water quality management. Next slide. And speaking of sustainable features, for sustainable trends in parking garage design, we see that there's an increased desire to have parking structures certified as a green garage through a program called ParkSmart, which is a way to promote sustainable design and operational practices for a parking facility, very similar to LEED for a building. Additionally, we're seeing an increase in the requirement for electric vehicle charging stations in new parking structures. The middle picture there shows a recent parking structure we completed that has EV charging stations. On the micromobility front, we're seeing also an increase in the desire to incorporate bike parking within structures. The picture on the bottom right is taken same garage in the DC area supporting the new Silver Line extension. Bike racks are located in a dedicated room. The gates weren't installed just yet in this photo, but you can see that there's an open space with benches and soon to be tables where bikes and their owner or bike owners can work on their bikes within that secure space. And finally, on the COVID-19 front, many parking structures are implementing touchless access and payment strategies. Touchless access has been around for a while, for contract parkers, AVI toll tag, proximity card readers, et cetera. But on the visitor and transit parker side of things, you have to physically engage the ticket dispenser and payment machines, which could increase the risk of transmission of germs. And now we're seeing vendors develop contactless parking strategies and payment strategies, pay by phone, Bluetooth readers that are being offered now as a mitigation strategy for that particular user group. Next slide. So now that we covered parking structures of the yesteryear, today, let's take a journey into the future. Next slide. From all indications, the future is quickly approaching. We will shortly enter a crossroads, really, with parking facility design. Do we design to accommodate other uses now? Do we design to for the oncoming and near autonomous vehicles, both of which drastically result and have different design parameters? Next slide. Each one of those has unique impact to structured design, as we see here. We're going to focus a little more on the adaptive reuse of parking structures and some potential strategies that we've been using. Next slide. This is an example of how to potentially design a parking structure that has the ability to convert to another use in the future. This particular example was completed as part of a design charrette we had with our client for a Sunset Gower development in Los Angeles in 2017. The structure was designed to adapt from parking to office space in phases, utilizing a top-down approach. Additionally, the cores were centrally located to serve both uses, as well as a detachable parking ramping system that can be decommissioned and disassembled from the top down. Finally, parking demand decreases to such a point where the development no longer requires parking on site. The balance of the ramps can be removed, and the leftover space can be converted to office through a horizontal expansion. Next slide. A more recent example and a different way of approaching adaptive reuse is, in lieu of designing the entire garage to be repurposed like the previous example, we look at a most likely scenario that parking demand in the future will decrease to a point where we could build the first two phases of the development as traditional parking structure design, and then the final phase can be convertible, which is directly under the future tower. The great thing about this approach that the potential reclaimed floors are all flat, there's no ramps, and you have alignment with the structural grid and cores. There are many considerations. Next slide. I won't go over them all, but this list is by no means comprehensive. However, next slide. It can be done. This is an example FIU parking garage. It was designed to have the entire bay convert to classroom space as the need for it grew. Next slide. Now let's quickly look at potential impacts of autonomous vehicles to our urban landscape. Next slide. This sketch is of a common city street with many lanes of traffic and small pedestrian walkways. Next slide. Now, as we move more toward walkable space in urban areas, AVs start to come online, and maybe this is what the streetscape of the future could look like. Fewer autos, auto lanes, they could be skinnier, AV-only lanes. It's sustainable, greener, healthier, and it's certainly something to think about. Next slide. However, what we don't want to do is create a situation where we lose the battle with the control over our shared curb space and creates chaos. Maria, what are your thoughts on the importance of shared curb space?
Thanks, Brian. Thanks so much. I'm excited to be here today. Always good time to talk about parking. So let's just dive in. Why is the curb a big deal? How you manage your curb can really help define your city. Do you want a city that favors sharing the streets, or is it a city that's focused on archaic uses? The curb is a valuable limited city asset that traditionally has never been given the love that it deserves. And this is important because, next slide, please. According to a UN report issued in May of 2018, urban areas hold 54% of the world's population. Next slide, please. By 2050, these areas are going to hold 68% of the world's population. Next slide, please. So cities can't keep building garages and we can't keep building curbs. The old adage, if you build it, they will come, really applies. The image here is a tollway in China, but there's examples, closer to home. If any of you have been to Houston, driven on the Katy Freeway around the Beltway 8 interchange, It's the same idea. We doubled the capacity on the Katy freeway to mitigate congestion, and instead we ended up with a huge freeway that is still congested and there's no space left to expand. So cities need different solutions. We have limited space and curb. Yes, even in a city the size of Houston, we have limited space. So what do? How do we manage our curb? Next slide, please. Since building more on-street parking is not a viable option, we need to better manage our existing supply, and we do that through a variety of tools and practices. We invest in technology to improve communication with our customers. We provide accurate parking availability data to try and get customers to parking spaces quickly so they're not circling. And we also keep planning for the future, like some of the future proofing that Brian discussed in his presentation about garages. Next slide, please. So 15 years ago, the priority at the curb was protecting it for private vehicles. You know, let's park as many privately owned vehicles as possible. Now cities have a different kind of attitude about the curb space, and we're looking at how do we move more people, not necessarily how do we accommodate more cars. You know, parking privately owned vehicles is the least important use for that curb. Looking forward, you know, that's going to continue to drop in priority as we seek to accommodate an increasing number of delivery vehicles and TNCs, and then eventually accommodate the autonomous vehicles that are headed our way. So in the age of COVID, parking is, you know, not as challenging, and cities have taken this time to try new things with less constraint because now we don't have so much demand for the curb space. For example, many cities are experimenting with pickup and drop-off areas for restaurants that were impacted by the pandemic. So we took metered parking spaces, replaced those with pickup zones so that customers can easily access their restaurants and grab their takeout and get out of there quickly. Some cities had started in this direction prior to the pandemic, but under the guise of having rideshare zones on the street. But clearly the pandemic made this practice more acceptable since people were now not demanding that curbside as much. In Houston, we went live with some rideshare only zones in March of 2020, so the timing was not so great. We converted public parking spaces. In some cases, we took entire blocks of public parking and converted these zones to rideshare only to accommodate the TNCs that were struggling to find curb space to safely pick up and drop off passengers in the Central Business District. In this instance, usage of the curb for rideshare was about safely getting people to their final destination or getting them, getting them to the TNC to go home. We worked with the TNCs to geofence. So much like an airport, you walked out of your restaurant or you walked out of the bar and you'd call your Lyft or your Uber, and it would direct you to the zone that we set up on the street. Unfortunately, our timing was just off, and we really didn't get to test it so much because the same week that we went live, I think a week later, the stay-at-home order for Houston was put in place. So hopefully we're going to try and see how we can test that whenever we get to whatever this new normal is post-COVID. Next slide, please. So to prepare for the future, cities are looking to digitize their curbs. This is a digital tool that maps out in great detail how curb spaces can be used across the city. It would also allow street users to better understand how to use this infrastructure. And in the future, most importantly, it's going to form the backbone of crucial data that programmers can feed to connected or autonomous vehicles so they understand not only how to navigate our streets, but also how and when and where they can pull over and use the curbs. So in parking, we have really limited real estate to communicate with our customers. It's really a sign on a post that we put on the side of the street. And, most of the time is that sign even being read. But how neat is it going to be when a connected vehicle drives into your central business district and the vehicle knows that the empty space it just passed is reserved for commercial deliveries, but that one block over is a street that has metered parking available for its use? I mean, do you even need to think about signs anymore? But, just thinking the ideas like this is really exciting, thinking about connected vehicles coming. Next slide, please. So now you've digitized your curb and your customers can use an app to find available parking because you're also pushing your availability that you're getting from your smart meters to this app. So the next thing you want to do is integrate a payment platform. And Brian touched on this earlier. You can have a pay by phone app or a pay by cell app for your customers so they can pay the meters. They can find and pay for parking in one app. We're always going to have to pay for parking in some form or fashion, but what COVID demonstrated is that payment by app quells fears in the public, and moving to the future, if a city has not adopted pay by app, they need to get that done. But more so, what cities should also be looking at is having multiple vendors who offer pay by app. Currently, most cities, Houston included, we select one pay by app operator and our customers are required to use that app. So we've created a monopoly in our city. But when we put a parking meter on the street, we don't say it's a Visa only parking meter or it's a MasterCard only parking meter. We take Discover, we take Amex, we take Visa, we take MasterCard, we take all the coins, we take all the bills. So cities need to offer their customers as many payment methods as possible. So why should we only limit ourselves to one app provider? Let the customer decide what they want to use. And also you get the vendors competing against each other to get the customers. And the more your adoption rate is increased, the more you can look at removing street furniture. So maybe you can have pay by phone zones only, and you don't have to have a meter on every block. In Houston, we've already started pushing out some meters and testing some pay by app zones they have no meter on the street, but we have one, within a block's walking distance if a customer wants to use the meter. I'll also give a shout out to the city of Austin, who worked with their pay by app provider and integrated with the holy grails of map. They've integrated with Google Maps. So that makes perfect sense because Google tells you how to get from point A to point B, but it never told you where to put your car once you got to point B. And so Austin has closed the loop on that. Next slide, please. So how can the parking industry prepare for and leverage trends that are shaping the future of parking? The answer to that question is data. And I think that answer goes across many industries, not just parking. Lots of cities are already tracking parking data. We have smart meters. Most of us have converted to smart meters. We have analytic systems that we can use. So we're using the data. We're making informed decisions based on that data. This is something that moving forward in the future is also going to be critical. So we use the data available from our systems to understand utilization trends over time so we can optimize the management of our parking assets. Just like hotels and airlines, the parking industry relies on selling its spaces as many times as possible for the best price. And an empty space means a loss of revenue. So in the short term, using data to understand things like peak periods, seasonal cycles, customer types, and overstays means that your operations can be streamlined to optimize utilization of that asset, and then of course maximize revenue. For the long term, this data analysis helps us be more agile to respond to change. And certainly nowadays, change comes fast and furious. TNCs and dockless mobility are great examples of disruptors that literally appeared overnight that cities had to respond to quickly. Next slide, please. So while we try to maximize use of our existing parking, we also recognize that it's finite. We can't accommodate all the cars. We have to be prepared to lose parking to support alternative modes of transportation. Cities increasingly look to transportation demand management strategies to help alleviate congestion. Bike lanes, transit-only lanes, micromobility, TNCs, all of these require curb. And if a city has to choose between public parking and a bike lane, guess what's usually going to win? It's going to be the bike lane, and rightly so, it's fine. Supporting alternative modes of transportation is going to become critical for parking organizations because we need to figure out how we charge for use of that curb. It's still a city asset. It's still being used by the general public. It's just used in a different way now. Metered parking was one thing. How do you monetize the curb for other uses? So we also need to think about electrification and the use of the public right-of-way for charging stations. Again, another solution that results in the loss of public parking. And finally, talk about sustainability. Cities talk about zero emissions, zero accidents. For some, we are moving to a world where car ownership isn't such a thing anymore, but perhaps mobility as a service is more the standard. How do we park these cars? Do we even need to park these cars? Does Maria now have a subscription to a service that picks me up in the morning, takes me to work, takes my daughter to school, comes and gets me in the evening? I don't need a parking space at work. Maybe I don't even need a garage anymore because I'm using the service. Or is Maria buying the autonomous vehicle and it's taking me to work, taking my daughter to school, and then going and parking itself in my garage until it's time for me to leave? Not sure how this is all going to work out. So how do cities plan for the future of AV when we're really not sure which way it's going to go? Next slide, please. And then finally, micromobility. We've seen a lot of cities experiment with this form of transportation, and lots of cities have developed solutions so that the scooters or bikes can share the right of way with pedestrians and vehicles. The sector is still defining itself. We've seen many different iterations of micromobility since 2017 when dockless bikes first came on the scene. You may know that Dallas was the first to welcome dockless bikes. And then once dockless bikes left the scene, they welcomed the e-scooters. And then recently, I think in the past few weeks, they have banned them outright from the city. So no micromobility in the city of Dallas. That's because cities are still struggling with developing the regulations to manage these in the right of way. The city of Denver has developed a program that marries micromobility to transit stations to tackle the first and last mile challenge. Lots of cities, well, in fact, all the cities that have micromobility are requiring operators to share aggregated trip data. And this is helpful to planning for future infrastructure like bike lanes, sidewalks, even how streets are designed. So micromobility is just another example of how cities need to rethink the organization of public space to accommodate these new forms of smart mobility and different uses of the curb. You know, that's the parking space. That was the traditional parking space that we're talking about. And parking organizations should be thinking about how they're going to manage the curb for all these different uses. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Priya so she can talk about mobility on a larger scale.
Thank you, Maria. Hi, everyone. I'm Priya Zachariah. I'm the manager for long-range planning at Metro. It's truly a delight to be with all of you tonight. The way I wanted to frame the transit discussion as it relates to parking was in kind of taking a look at three different aspects. One, definitely to start with METROnext and provide that context. It is the transit long-range plan on the record. So we do want to start there. And the second was then to jump to how do we think about parking within the transit context and how the approach to parking is evolving and has evolved over time. And finally, I want to close out by talking about some of our pilot projects, some of the innovative solutions that we are currently looking at, and how we can use that as a first and last mile mobility and connect to some of our parking locations. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So as we think about METROnext, as was mentioned earlier, the METROnext long-range plan was passed was on the ballot referendum last November, passed by a very resounding 68%, almost 70% majority. So a big mandate for more transit in the region. Next slide, please. And before I get into that, just a quick overview of the range of services that Metro provides. We, of course, have our local bus service. We also serve the commuter travel market with our park and rides. We have light rail, paratransit service. We have something called the van pool service. Not a whole lot of people know about that. Metro also operates the HOV and HOT, the toll lanes. We have our own police department, and of course, we participate in the Regional Emergency Management Center at Transtar. Next slide, please. So this is the METROnext moving forward plan, and I don't want to take up time and go into all of the different projects. I'm sure a lot of you who are participating are pretty familiar with this, but I do want to talk about some of the highlights of the plan. So the plan, the moving forward plan, is a total program of projects which amounts to about $7.5 billion. So that's billion with a B. And this is a subset of a larger vision plan, which went beyond the service, metro service area. And the cost of that was about a little north probably of $35 billion. So some of the salient facts related to the plan, of course, this plan has multiple modes. So as you can see, there's a number of different colors on the map. So what you see in pink is bus rapid transit. Our very first bus rapid transit project has gone into revenue service, which is the Uptown line. You saw a few of the slides of the transit center at its southern end on Brian's slides. So that's the Uptown line. And so we have bus rapid transit, which is a part of the METROnext moving forward plan. We, of course, have extensions to our light rail system. We have everything that you see fanning out into our freeway corridors in the gray is additions and investments in our commuter network or the regional express network. And what you see in the orange, the grid of lines going north and south, those are improvements or optimization corridors. We call them our boost program, which are optimization of a high capacity, a high ridership bus corridors. So in addition to this, which is a little unusual and a little, off of the traditional path of standard long-range plans, is that we also have a lot of operational improvements. So these are non-capital investments in the system, increases to our revenue service, investments in frequency, and so on and so forth. So that's definitely a part of the commitments within METRONext. And one last thing I want to leave you with is this whole plan development process was equal parts planning and technical work and equal parts public involvement. So this was a plan that was involved, that was informed by a lot of public discussion and dialogue with multiple stakeholders over the course of 2.5 to 3 years. Next slide, please. So some of the highlights of the plan, of course, all the major investments, like I said, with the different modes. But a couple of things that I do want to underline and which are going to be relevant to the rest of the conversation. We have 110 miles of the commuter network or the regional express network, which is our park and ride network. And another factoid on this slide I want to point out is the plan includes 21 new and improved park and rides and multimodal transit centers. Next slide, please. And if you look at what the plan is going to deliver, just a few of them, which are highlighted on this slide, at its full build out in 2040, with all of the investments in place, one can expect to see with all of these trends in place, of course, population and employment. And I think some of them are already being challenged as we speak with COVID, to ridership, for ridership to increase almost a little over double of what we have currently. And of course, that has positive implications for taking cars off the streets, for fewer vehicle miles traveled, and of course, reduction in overall emissions. Next slide, please. So the question that needs to be asked probably is, considering that transit really is in the business of taking out of their cars, what are we doing in a parking discussion? And really, the answer to that is serving the commuter travel market, the suburban travel market, providing, that the regional express network is a huge part of the metro story. And so what you're seeing on the slide here is, some of the, some photographs from one of our park and rides. This is on the 290 corridor, the Kirkendall park and ride, which is, so essentially how it works is there's a bus, a bus facility in the center of a parking lot. Many of our parking lots have acreages which are in about, like Addicts is about 39 or 40 acres with parking for about 2,400 cars. And the question really is, how do you get from this model of parking to the next slide, please? To this, this is a visualization of the Addicts park and ride. So this is not what Addicts looks like right now, but it could look like this potentially in the future. Next slide, please. Or how could we get from here? This again is a visualization of potential development, something that could happen along one of our light rail lines where we really don't own real estate, but we have the transit. So this is in and around the coffee plant station. And I think you can see that in the background. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So this is kind of a simulation of what densification or development around one of our light rail stations could look like. So these are just two cases. In the case of the park and ride is where Metro actually owns real estate, and in the case around a light rail station where we bring the transit, and the transit is what induces or is a big factor in inducing development and higher densities around the transit station. Next slide, please. This is the West Park Lower Uptown Transit Center that we also saw in some of Brian's slides, connecting to the Uptown BRT. Next slide, please. So how does it work with the context of METRONext? So we are back again at this slide, but I want to point out something a little different and spend a little bit more talking about the METRONext plan. So as you can see, there are multiple modes. What I haven't pointed out previously is the blue is light rail. What we see is one of the ways in which we almost, I think of it almost as kind of challenging the spoke and hub mobility destiny. So we are kind of tied into the spoke and hub system, as you can see from how our freeway corridors are laid out. But what we can do in terms of bringing high capacity transit to the mix is when you have these corridors that provide high ridership, high frequency, all day service that are overlaid on some of these commuter networks, you end up creating these locations. And that's what's shown on these, where you see the dashed circles. These are these multi-mobility hubs, that's a mouthful, where you can transfer actually from where you bring together these different commuter travel markets. You connect commuter travel market to LRT or BRT. And what that really does in terms of travel patterns is that it opens up multiple service patterns, multiple mobility choices by bringing people into these locations. So this definitely was a very deliberate part of the METROnext moving forward plan. And the way that we can think about development around these hubs is not only is parking one of the amenities, but also it becomes a part of a set of amenities and livability principles that can develop at these locations. Next slide, please. So I wanted to share with you some of the work that Metro had done around this, and we call it, of course, as you know, transit-oriented development. So we took a look at some of, the real estate that we own. This is the Addicts Park and Ride, and we went through this exercise where we worked with the City of Houston, with H-GAC. We looked at some of our light rail stations as well as our park and ride locations, and we went through this exercise of taking a look at how could these potentially be developed. What could be, what would be the program of spaces in terms of how much of office, how much of commercial, retail, how much residential, integrated with parking garages could be used to make better use of the land area that we have. So this is off of the I-10 corridor. This is the Addicts Park and Ride. And this is the visualization that you saw previously was a takeoff on this. Next slide, please. And so in the next couple of slides, I'm not going to get into the details of how we did this analysis really, but we took a look at what are some of the existing land uses. This is again the Kirkendall Park and Ride. If we have these land uses of multifamily residential, commercial, retail, what kind of land uses could one expect? What are some of the development trends that we are seeing? What are the population and employment, the demographic trends, and how could all of that tie together into developing a program of spaces that could be developed in and around the park and ride? So that was some of the analysis that went into this work. Next slide, please. And we also thought of how, what are some of the gaps in our existing first and last mile networks and how improvements in help connect all of these users together. Please. So the big takeaway in looking at our park and ride networks as well as our TOD study was that a transit agency brings the transit to the equation, but at the end of the day, it is really it's the art and science of development where you have to bring multiple actors together. You have to identify a diverse set of stakeholders in terms of partnerships. You have to think about development that is transit supportive, which is what we saw in some of the previous slides. We have to think about connecting multiple modes and definitely leveraging on our investment. So it's a whole program that needs to be laid out with multiple actors to be able to leverage and develop these very livable centers and our multimodal hubs. Please. So with that, I wanted to talk a little about some of the emerging transportation options and what are some of the contributions of innovative solutions going forward. Next slide, please. So some of the things Metro has been working on, specifically at the Office of Innovation, is we're thinking of when those technologies, things like could be pruned. So these are like basically buses that are electronically connected with some of our infrastructure investments to kind of get a whole lot more capacity out of our infrastructure investments. And I'll be talking about the TSU pilot project in the next slides, and we touched upon the Metro Rapid. This picture is actually an Uptown BRT bus. Next slide, please. So this is the pilot project that Metro in partnership with TSU and H-GAC undertook. It's the University District Project, the Community Circulator, the automated vehicle. So this is, the vehicle is supplied by a manufacturer called Easy Mile. And I think this pilot ran for about 6 to 8 months. The capacity of the vehicle was about 12 passengers in all, and it operated on a closed loop at TSU on the Tiger Walk. we got about 7,000 to 7,500 trips and the data related to that. And there was no fare as such that was charged for this, but everyone who wanted to ride would have to download an app and complete a survey. So that really helped Metro get a lot of useful data. So this has really helped us lay the groundwork on how to integrate automated vehicle technology in some of our existing networks. A huge application for that would be in making that first and last mile connection to some of our high capacity, high frequency transit networks. I want to let everyone know that this was phase 1 and we are thinking about phase 2, but in a slightly different environment where the operating environment has some more challenges. There's mixed traffic, potentially would be to cross a rail line. So there'll be a lot more expectations of the technology itself. And at some point, hopefully in the near future, we should be embarking on phase 2 of this pilot. Next slide, please. Some other things that are also being integrated right now as we think about parking and public transit is, of course, integrating with multiple modes. We've talked about local bus, commuter bus, bus rapid transit, but also with the first and last mile technologies such as bikes and so on. We talked about the automated vehicle pilots. There's also dynamic messaging and wayfinding that we're thinking about in a number of our garages. Thinking about Wi-Fi and integrating Bluetooth technology, universal accessibility, as well as providing electric charge stations at a number of our facilities. Next slide, please. And finally, we did want to talk about the impact of COVID. That's something that we have to address, in our current environment. So just to share the information, what Metro has seen is that there has been a drop-off in our ridership. So our park and ride system has taken a big hit given that a lot of people are doing the work from home. But overall across the system, we see that there's been approximately a 40 to 50% drop in ridership, but it is slowly picking back up. What Metro has been doing is really all of our local buses have been working on a Saturday schedule, so on a weekend schedule. And buses are only allowed to fill up to 50% capacity so that people are able to implement the social distancing within the vehicle as well. We are requiring that everybody on the bus be using masks and maintaining social distancing. The operators are protected by installation of plexiglass shields. Initially, we had instituted, it was free fare. There was no fare collection when COVID had just started, but we have now resumed fare collection and boarding is only again resumed to be from the front door. On our park and ride service is only currently operating in a few of our corridors and mostly at a midday schedule. We have maintained the park and ride service to the TMC throughout, from the beginning of when COVID had started. Next slide, please. And some of the things that we are thinking about in the long term, it does seem that like COVID is going to be with us for some time. It is not, we don't anticipate that we are going to transition out of it extremely quickly, but we are hopeful in integrating that into some of, our practices. For instance, looking at materials that can withstand more frequent cleaning. That has been a feature that Metro has instituted over the last few months, more and more frequent cleaning on all of our equipment, particularly equipment that is deployed out in the public. Research on the use of materials that are used in high touch areas and for high touch surfaces, using the UV light for cleaning and using research on using, how sanitizing dispensers can be best deployed across the system, across all of our facilities, and how we can function in terms of removing some of the common amenities and how that would look in the long term, and in being able to still provide that same level of transit service and customer amenities and customer comfort. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to Lisa. Now we've talked about a number of things. We looked at parking from past and the present. We looked at micromobility. We looked at transit from a 40,000 foot view. And now to tie all of that together, over to you, Lisa. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. And yeah, this is the really fun part of the presentation where I get to take all of the great things that everyone talked about and kind of bring some sense to where the future of parking is going. I just wanted to, next slide, please. mention 4 themes that were prevalent in each and every one of the presentations. And first and foremost, that land use, parking, and transportation have always been linked and will be into the future. That includes the parking element and how that adjusts. Number 2, that technology has been and will continue to be a game changer, though some technologies may not pan out in the same way as others will, and you'll see things happening in phases. Number 3, COVID-19 is forcing some different practices, some of which may extend into the future, but it's not quite sure how that's going to play out. And really, I think that the biggest message out of all of this for all of us in parking is that we need to better plan for uncertainty and for trends in a way that conventional practice hasn't really led us. So I'm going to go over not just what we plan, but how we plan. And we're going to talk about a couple of game changers in detail and how to tease out the parking element, and then put it all together in sort of a land use story. Next slide. So planning for uncertainty. A lot of the work I've been doing over the past 3 years at the national level is with scenario planning and technology foresight. And these are 2 different methods where you can explore the what ifs and alternative futures. But then for technology foresight, get together with experts to anticipate the likely evolution and market adoption for technology, because it's that market adoption that matters. Not just the fact that it's out there. Next slide. There's also strategic planning. So you can come up with roadmaps of near-term actions, set your metrics, and then plug in contingencies so that if parking is higher than you expected, then you've already thought out that game plan. But then if it's lower than expected, you've also done that as well. And a lot of times we use pilots to try and figure out exactly what we're testing, to bring in stakeholders, to make sure we don't spend a lot of money on something that's not going down the right path, and then just to test and iterate. We saw a slide of a parking ramp that could be disassembled over time, and that's just one of those really good strategies that you can put into play. Next slide. Before we can really talk about uncertainty, you have to kind of understand it at a deeper level. So let's go through what some of these change drivers or forces of change are. And of course, some of the ones that stood out in this presentation were in the near term for COVID-19. And then what's happening with shared use mobility. At first, it was kind of a novelty, and then it got serious and we had all kinds of problems. And then COVID hit, and all of a sudden the world of micromobility looked like it was just going to be gone forever. And now the companies have really rebounded. Just to show you how some of these trends play out. Next slide. In the midterm, let's look at some of these things that are playing out with a little bit of a longer time frame. So certainly with parking, we've got self-park technology in cars. Maybe during the Super Bowl, you saw the Hyundai commercial about Park the Car. And of course, some of the parking technologies you saw presented in earlier presentations. Midterm work from home has been a real big focus for a lot of people, and whether or not this is going to extend into the future, which has huge implications for parking. Climate change is another trend that is going to really impact the built environment and transportation overall. And then e-commerce kind of came out of nowhere. Well, maybe out of somewhere. We've been shopping on Amazon for a while, but over the past couple of years, and especially COVID, that has really accelerated. Next slide. And then, of course, we've got some of these long-term trends that we know are just now starting to be tested in places. They've got concepts, and that's job fleet automation, and then with delivery drones. And if we think about it a little bit, this will be another presentation this time next year. We'll talk about what these trends have to do with parking. But right now, they're just so conceptual, and we've got our hands full with some of these other technologies. Next slide. So what does scenario planning look like, and what can it look like for parking? So I wanted to take two of the variables, working from home and then automation, and that could be vehicle or parking, but usually both. And usually what you do is you kind of set up these futures where it's a high-low kind of combination. Next slide. And then what you try and do is think about, well, if work from home is high, but automation is slow, then you'll have a lot of people who are usually commuting, maybe sometimes 45 minutes, an hour a day, and they're going to stick closer to home and be looking for some of these activities, places to co-work, places to meet clients, things like that. If work from home is low and automation is slow, we're kind of returning to where we were pre-COVID. And then, of course, if automation is fast, you'll have a lot of higher tech sorts of situations in the suburbs and in the metro, though at different degrees. Next slide. And then from there, you kind of start working with your modelers, your forecasters, and you start to think about, okay, what are the exact numbers that we're going to be looking for? And then how do we feed those into the models that we need to forecast traffic, parking, commercial real estate? What does it mean to follow some of these trends, like percent of cars with auto park installed? Maybe some of the fleet mix statistics. You're going to want to look at some of the pilot results, because those are really good sources of data that can help you in some of your models. And of course, this modeling is going to be taking place constantly, just so that you can constantly keep up with some of the different information, some of the shifts. You never know what will happen. Perhaps big players will pull out. So that's just a snapshot of what it means to look at parking through a scenario planning lens. Next slide. I actually like technology foresight, and that's really where you're pulling out the crystal ball. And as I said, a lot about technology, the real thing that matters is market adoption. And really, how are consumers reacting? Because 57 to 75%, depending on which poll you look at, of consumers say they will never get into an autonomous vehicle. So of course, we've got to really factor some of those things in, but in a phased manner. So for parking, we've got our traditional lots, and then with trending, we've got a lot of smart parking, a lot of payment systems. In the emerging field, we're testing the autonomous garages and self-park. And then, of course, in the future, we kind of think about summoning from remote spaces. Next slide. But the critical thing about technology foresight is you have all these different types of interlinked technologies that are evolving on their own timeframes, but they still kind of interact, and there's feedback loops and how they interlink. So if you're a regional modeler, say at H-GAC, this is kind of what you're going to be looking at. Next slide. Because the autonomous cars and the autonomous parking may be evolving at different sorts of phases. So how do you work with garage owners, and how do you phase in some of the way that cars are parked and how they approach these garages? Or maybe even autonomous cars don't even go to some garages but go to others. Next slide. Again, I just wanted to point out some of these evolving technologies that are coming sooner than later. And there's a lot of efficiencies for these. So you don't have to assume that you're going to have to automatically march into the future and work backwards. Some of these things are already here and really should be commanding some attention so that we can start to get some of those efficiencies that Brian talked about, but this time from technology, not from the way we design buildings. Next slide. I do want to point out self-parking cars, because these could really be a game changer, the way the math works out. So some professors looked at an optimal layout, next slide, and found that some of these lots or some of these garages could decrease the space needed by 62% and even higher. It's just a way of getting cars that you can program to move in and out of spaces to make room and allow those other cars, almost like a puzzle, to start to get into the spaces. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about e-commerce, because this does have a lot of implications from parking, but in different ways. So I thought I'd start out by just kind of looking at the traditional supply chain, so that you had factories or ports if you have imported goods that go to a distributor. And then what you're talking about is trucking and truck parking, which is a big deal for a lot of truckers, especially because they have to meet federal standards on how many hours a day they can be in operation. And then from the distribution to the retail store, and of course, that's where we've got all those shoppers who are coming. And that's what drives a lot of these surface parking lots, because we've got standards from the Institute for Transportation Engineers and other associations, of course, that tell us how much parking we need. And of course, the buyer is that last mile. And they're the ones who are using the parking and the loading. And I do want to point out that it's not just people buying things, but people also returning things. Because with e-commerce, over 30% of everything ordered online is shipped back. So let's kind of think about that growing dynamic. Next slide. And let's start looking at online ordering writ large. Because it's not just goods and services, but the real increase has been seen in groceries and online food, especially during COVID. We're seeing all these new types of distribution buildings coming into play. So cold storage, ghost kitchens, which take place outside of a restaurant, but are in place to actually fulfill online orders. You've got sorting centers, micro fulfillment, dark stores, and retail groceries. So, you know, a Target or a Walmart or even a Whole Foods now becomes not just the grocery store, but a distribution center. And then going into the future, you've got not only shoppers coming in and some of the home delivery, store pickup, delivery services like Grubhub. In the future, we're looking forward to some of the drone delivery by air drones, but also by drone van hybrids, which I think will come into line much, much sooner than a lot of the air drones. But think about those going into master plan communities where you can park a truck once and air drones will deliver with a much smaller carbon footprint to individual households. So what does that mean for parking? Next slide. It means that we're going to have to look at some of our models because they're probably outdated. So what do all these new sorts of movements look like when we have no precedent at all from which to extrapolate what the likely future is going to look like? If anything from this presentation, I think that extrapolation to the future is really kind of a model that is going to give way to one where you are looking more at either scenario planning or even dynamic management, because you're collecting so much data that lets you allocate your resources much better. So with all this e-shopping, we're looking at things like shopper dwell times and parking demand that are no longer going to follow how the past was. And then of course we've got Amazon and other delivery companies that want to get you your goods in 30 minutes or less. So remember how excited you were when Amazon had 2-day delivery? Now they're aiming to get things almost immediately to your doorstep. Next slide. So pulling it all together, we've got all these different technologies which could begin to interact and alter the shape of how parking takes place. It could be shuttles to parking, which is a trend that's happening now. And the one I'm looking at in the lower right-hand corner is Toyota has this vehicle platform that is autonomous and changes throughout the day. So it could be a coffee store in the morning, an office, a delivery vehicle, a pizza delivery truck. And think about what that means, not only for parking, but for commercial real estate. As we go from buildings that pay taxes to vehicles that, you know, at this point in time, if they're electric, are really changing the dynamics of how we pay for infrastructure. Next slide. And then this last slide, I really want to hammer home that really we're in this to talk about people, because parking and buildings and sidewalks sound so functional, but of course they are very much related to people's lives and convenience and delight, and the ability to really chase opportunity. So in this slide, this is a building with no parking whatsoever, and it can be achieved because you've got the shared parking out front, you've got the autonomous shuttle on one side and the bus route on the other. You've got a first floor mobility room where you can keep your own bike, your strollers, and then of course on the very right hand side, the scooter share. And then we did the building deliberately with these insights so that you could have drone delivery to individual balconies and cut out all that storage. So with that, next slide. I'm done, and I'm going to hand it over to Mike so that we can get to the best part, which is the Q&A.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to all the presenters for this informative material. We'll now turn our videos on, everyone, and we'll start answering some questions in this roundtable portion of the program. Drones on the balcony. I can't wait to get mine. You can't necessarily talk about the future of parking without talking about what a lot of you touched on, and that's this connected self-parking, autonomous vehicles, and robo-taxis. My question to all of you would be, share your thoughts on this, and maybe we'll start with the off-street scenario. We'll go to Brian Lozano, and what are your thoughts on this parking structures and the reuse of parking structures and maybe other considerations to be built in, understanding that autonomous vehicles may be taking off quicker than we think, or maybe they won't.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, this has been a lot of, study on our end in terms to see what that impact could be. Again, as I mentioned before, we're kind of at this crossroads really of, do we design to repurpose parking structures for another use, which has certain implications on floor-to-floor heights, where we position ramps and circulation, versus designing for a fully autonomous future, which has lower floor-to-floor heights because you wouldn't have necessarily the public walking around the garage. You also have tighter space. I think Lisa had a good graphic in her presentation that showed some of the efficiencies gained by fully autonomous vehicles. And then obviously, the turning radiuses could be improved. Who knows what the future holds? You could have, four-wheel turning maneuvers where the geometry requirements that we normally have for self-parking garages would be much tighter. I think the biggest impact, though, would be on the floor-to-floor heights, whether we, make the garages super efficient to fit that one need, or do we look at having it where the taller floor-to-floor heights to fit some type of repurposing in the future, office space or residential, some other type of use, which also has impacts on the floor loading and things of that nature. But
I have lived in Montrose for around about.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, please continue, Brian.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, so no, that was it. I was just saying that I think there's just so many different applications and parameters that could affect the structure itself. However, if we're able to plan them properly, that we're able to accommodate, multi types of use and also accommodate that future autonomous future.
Thank you. And Maria, you said that communities have to be prepared to lose on-street parking as a result of a lot of this. And obviously there's other modes that are just as important as drive, the bus lanes, or, make bus travel more convenient, bike lanes, make it safer and more comfortable for bicyclists. So it helps encourage those. Those are all great things. Losing on-street parking, though, that's, maybe 6 months ago, that was something you really couldn't think about doing, but now more communities are doing it, and it's being repurposed. Do you look forward to maybe self-parking vehicles, maybe improving the efficiency of curb space, or what are some other thoughts you might have on?
Well, I think it's tough to, think about what's going to happen. I just, there's a lot of things out there, but definitely with autonomous vehicles, they're going to be looking for that curb space for pickup and drop off. I don't expect someone's going to park an autonomous vehicle on the curb anymore, right? It's, if I own the vehicle, maybe I'll send it back to my home. It'll stay in my garage all day and then come pick me up in the evening. Or if it's mobility as a service and it's a service that I'm subscribing to, that vehicle is going to be servicing all kinds of customers after it takes care of me. So, how, especially in central business districts where we have a lot of parking and garages and we manage the on-street, in an AV world, which is, I personally think it's really far away. I think it's a long way off. I think I'm going to be gone and retired and out of the business. So I try not to think about it too much. It hurts my head. But, those cars are probably not going to be here. Maybe they're parking out in cheaper land, because the central business land is really expensive. And to use that for garages and surface lots, when you have AV vehicles, it just doesn't make sense. So at some point, I don't think parking is all going to go away, but we're definitely going to see a decrease when that kind of technology is adapted to, very across the board use.
Sure, that might be a little more long-term. Priya, you mentioned the suburban market and the Texas Southern University experiment, and I think you have some projects that are a little bit more near-term than perhaps each of us owning an autonomous vehicle that drives itself and parks itself, and we don't ever have to worry about the frustrations ever again. That's probably a little bit further away, as Mari has just said. Can you talk about the public transportation and maybe how that might impact like suburban markets?
Sure, yeah, absolutely, Mike. So, if you think about from a technology perspective, I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, a future where every one of us owns, like our personal automated pod is hopefully many, many years away. But, we do start thinking about some of those nascent technologies. And you're right, the TSU project was a great pilot and it gave us a lot of good feedback. And surprisingly, some of that feedback was really about the charging capacity of the vehicle itself. The vehicle surprisingly did very well in that kind of an environment. I mean, there were issues with the sensors, and I was expecting that would be our, what we would learn from that, from the pilot. But it was really about the charge per mile that that you can really get out of the charging docks and the charging stations. So I mean, some go on that, but from a mass transit perspective, a couple of different two ends of the spectrum. So if you all might have heard about the university corridor, so that's a part of METRONext. It is in our 5-year CIP. Hopefully we'll be starting work on that project. In the METRONext little project, it was one of our most productive projects in terms of ridership. So that is in, for a large part of the project, it's in Metro owned a dedicated transitway alongside the West Park corridor. The issue with that is the capacity. It might be capacity restrained if we think about it as BRT. And I'm just posing this as a technology solution. But what if we were to think about it as automated vehicles that could be platooned? So I had a slide in my presentation on buses that could be platooned. So these are essentially automated vehicles that are connected electronically. They are connected like rail cars, but they're connected electronically. So the deployment of them becomes a whole lot more flexible. So, when we are thinking about putting in and investing in really expensive infrastructure, if we can think about, extracting every bit of capacity in terms of people throughput by the use of automation, that is at one end of the spectrum from the perspective of mass transit, really, really productive and useful. Because otherwise, to address that kind of potential demand in that corridor, do we then need to go to something really much more expensive like light rail? So that's kind of balancing of that. That's one end of the spectrum, for the application of technology. The other application really is to provide the first and last mile connectivity. So if you remember from the slide, there was, I did not bring it up or point it out, so it's likely that many of you may have missed that on the slide. There's this thing called community connectors. So what we are seeing in a lot of our freeway corridors, I mean, a lot of them are in that hub and spoke. They all point towards downtown. So for a long time, our travel patterns were everybody kind of funneling to downtown because it is, our main job center, our main employment center. But you're starting to see pretty robust reverse commute patterns. So if you think about reverse commuting, you've left your car somewhere closer to downtown where you live, and you're commuting outward, say in the I-10 corridor or the I-45 North corridor. But once you get there, how do you distribute to your place of employment? I mean, you can do it through bikes, electric bikes, but your individual, your automated vehicle distributor could be, for 6 to 8 people could be a great application for a community connector to provide that last mile connectivity, or to get out some of the folks who are in, say some of these distribution centers and fulfillment centers that are coming up in some of the outer areas of, where land is cheap, to connect to a high capacity transit network. So to use, automated vehicles to provide that kind of connectivity where one doesn't necessarily have to think about parking. And the third thing I want to think out, put out there is based on what Brian said, like if we do think about bringing together a multiplicity of users in our multimodal hubs, and if those, if we can make them adaptive and flexible, where you can adaptively reuse some of the place allocated to parking, so that in the future when parking isn't needed as much, it could be it could be live, work, play. But as long as those users are around these multimodal hubs around the region, I think it makes it much more viable. So I think across the spectrum from the perspective of transit, there's a wide range of uses and applications for technology in the future. Fascinating.
Lisa, you have a lot of experience in this kind of a topic. And Priya mentioned e-bikes. I love my e-bike. I think it's a way of the future, right? You're not like especially in Houston, you're not necessarily a sweaty mess when you get to where you're going after a bike trip. And people like me who stopped training for the Olympics long ago, it's definitely a way to still get exercise and get outside. I love it. You mentioned something in the chat about fleet companies or auto companies banking on this model of shared fleets. Should I have my e-bike and then a subscription to a particular car service that would allow me to have it? Is that what you're envisioning?
That could be one of the models. And of course, there's a lot of studies that are coming up. I read one just recently from the U.S. Department of Energy. And what they show is that if all AVs are owned, VMT and congestion go through the roof. So the only way to tame the VMT and congestion is through a shared model. And especially with, the transit model. And I think for AVs, I'm a big fan of the transit model more than I am for the individual cars. I just think it will bring a whole new, breathe whole new life into what transit is and what it can be.
Yeah. That's an incredible point. That gets down to like a policy, and then how are we going to influence the market, or how's the market going to react to certain pricing structures that speak to that.
So Mike, I want to intervene. We do have a question, and I think it builds nicely off the topic that we have at hand, and it comes from Kirk Myers, and he wonders, what are your thoughts on potential future privatization of mobility? And I apologize, my screen just moved. But what is the future of privatization with mobility? And this is just a note that we have about 12 minutes left to our session.
Sure. Anybody want to jump in and field the question on privatization of mobility?
So I think the last answer was kind of going in that direction about how, the AVs in the future will be privatized. But, the question actually addresses the here and now as well. And if you look at a lot of the mobility as a
you
service.
working, honey? You over there?
So there's that aspect. I'm curious to see what the other speakers have to say about what they're seeing as far as privatization already creeping into the work they're doing.
Yeah, anyone else have any thoughts on privatization? If not, one of the things I really wanted to touch on, and this is going to probably eat up the last 12 minutes of the program, and we don't have to touch on the C word, the COVID necessarily too much. You all kind of touched on that a little bit in there. We're all kind of familiar with that, and thank you for making that part of your presentations. But this idea, and Priya, it was absolutely part of your presentation, this idea of urban and suburban environments. And how those different environments and users have, expectations, and some of them are a little bit different, and some of them are the same expectations. Convenience is probably one of those. What are the high-level principles that can be shared in both of those environments that those who watch this may want to be really aware of? I think you hit on a few of those points. All of you hit on a lot of these points, but what would you want to, as a takeaway, as a high level principle to share, no matter if you're an urban or a suburban environment?
Right. So I think, first and foremost, recognizing that we have these different environments. Every region has a history and a story. And ours is that, we, I think to a great extent, still continue to be very car-centric. And to kind of embrace that and to kind of shape your solutions around that. Like I said, our freeways kind of shape how this region has developed. A lot of our land uses, they are developed in a spoken hub, pattern. And that is to stay unless you completely break down the freeway system, which is not going to happen. So one is to therefore have recognized how the region is growing and changing and evolving, and where those different, to understand that there's population growth, there's sheer growth that's happening in the suburbs. So next, we really took a look at, some of the demographic changes. There's densification. Densification is not happening in the outer reaches of our service area. It's more a function of what's happening inside the loop, even now inside the Beltway to an extent. And so therefore, those are two different, travel solutions. Your mobility solutions are different. One that addresses growth, one that addresses density. And what METRONext does is to kind of recognize these two different travel markets. So one of them is, if you think about what, the suburban commuter market is the point-to-point express, get me there fast kind of service. Whereas when you have your light rail, your bus rapid transit, which is essentially light rail on rubber tires, it's your all-day high frequency point-to-point, taking you to multiple activity centers. They're not like from one point to the other point necessarily. So to recognize, first of all, that you have two different travel markets, to recognize that the travel solutions or the transit solution is different for both of them, taking into consideration growth and density. And then the third thing is really to be able to connect them. If you are a commuter, you're probably your entire day, you're not going to be just using a commuter service. For instance, once I get downtown, I get on light rail and go out for lunch. So you might be able to, that might be one of the needs, your transit needs during, a day, a week, a month. And so those multimodal hubs where you, for instance, if you come in on a BRT, you connect to, like, if you looked at the Uptown West Park Transit Center, come in on 59, you can connect to the Uptown BRT. So you essentially change from a commuter to going to Uptown, to the Galleria, to the Northwest Transit Center. And it kind of opens up a range of service patterns, mobility options for you. So connecting those, and what you remember that slide with those circles all around. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at, those multimodal hubs. So I think those are kind of the big things. And finally, I'll just leave you with this, that land use is a huge part of a successful transit solution. So land use contributes to how people use transit. It's in addition to the convenience, the frequency, the service itself, the kind of land uses that are transit supportive, that have a lot to do with how well a transit service performs. So that nexus between transit and land use is something that should always be kept front and center. And I think regions should really work to kind of strengthen that collaboration between agencies that work in these two, areas.
Exactly. Lisa, do you want to build on that thought at all with land use at all? That we do have some other questions related to land use as well. So this is.
Yeah, and I'll answer that land use question. I'll wrap that in. Because Houston, as someone pointed out, doesn't have zoning. I think that one of the key, or a couple of the key tools in the toolbox going forward, where there's so many unknowns of parking, especially if you've got high demand now and you pretty much know it's going to be reduced, is that from a land use standpoint, is actually establish parking districts, because that's what's going to support shared parking, which is really your key to contingency parking. And this is where you start getting into scenario planning speak. And contingency just means that you pre-plan that if things go different directions, you've already thought out and you've already prepared for some of those tools. And district parking is one of my favorite tools, no matter if there's a driver or not. And then set the stage for some of that shared parking. amongst different landowners and figure out what the incentives are to have some of that spillover and that parking in a district.
Sure. Maria, you know a little bit of something about parking districts, working in the field. Do you have anything to add to what Lisa mentioned on the importance of doing that?
Yeah, so in the city of Houston, yes, we don't have zoning, but we also don't have parking requirements in our central business district, and the planning department recently expanded that boundary. So our central business district has never required any parking, but we have 63,000 parking spaces off street. That's not the on street, that's the off street. So even without the government saying you've got to do this, we managed to get all that parking because the banks are not going to build these buildings without the parking. And so the planning department in the past, I think it was just this past summer, they expanded the boundaries of our market-based parking area. So Midtown and East Downtown also now fall into the central business district boundary where they don't have to abide by the parking requirements. So that's a great thing that's happening here in Houston. Talking about the urban and suburban differences as it relates to the on-street, for us, we rarely get a call to go visit a neighborhood outside of the Beltway 8 interchange. There's just no parking problems in neighborhoods like that. But as we come in, particularly within the 610 loop, as the city densifies, as we build upwards instead of going outwards, that curb space is much more in demand. So there's a significant difference in the curb space for sure between the urban and suburban environment. You can park in front of your house in the suburbs. Urban environment in the Montrose area, you might have to park, a block or two away from your house if you don't have parking.
As someone who keeps track of marketing, the markets for providing parking solutions, Brian, I'd love to get your take on this urban and suburban environment that we need to consider.
Yeah, I think, Maria hit it on the head. I think it's, even within the Houston metro area, you have different requirements, where it becomes more, especially within the CBD, becomes more of a free market in terms of what the developers want to provide that they can get financing for, whereas you have plenty of land that's more outside of, let's say, like Maria said, the Beltway 8 area, where we see a lot more or a lot less of structured parking solutions, but more of where land is plentiful, surface parking lots are more prevalent. However, we're also seeing this trend, especially on the healthcare side, where the Texas medical centers become so dense, and then a lot of the institutions are starting to, create this model where they're taking their central campus and then moving it out to the suburbs to meet the specific needs there. And then those are becoming almost like mini medical campuses, where at the beginning they may have started out with, a hospital and then a MOB, well, MOB first, and then it becomes a hospital type campus, where plenty of surface parking lot space. And then as they start to densify and the demand grows, they're starting to do structured parking solutions. So we're also seeing kind of this interesting trend as folks are in terms of the medical centers are going out to the community and meeting their needs there. We're also starting to see some densification there, and structured parking solutions becoming more prevalent as well.
Fantastic. I know we're getting on the end of the time here. I think you all kind of hit on this. We have to, value parking and the convenience of parking, and definitely make that part of our considerations as a component of any type of development. I want to, again, thank you all for your presentations. Thank everyone for participating in this session. Anita, do you have any final thoughts that people should take away for tomorrow's sessions?
Sure, and I just want to say a big thank you to Mike Burns for leading us through this discussion, and to all our panelists for your diligence in putting this together and making it so interesting and feasible, and the ability to follow the discussion has been very nice. We have been talking about the future of parking, and as we heard from our panelists, some of the things may seem far-fetched and some are right around the corner. So we're sort of in the future of parking in terms of the evolution of how we're starting to think about parking. However, I think as we think about our region, we have to recognize that we are in different phases within each of our communities with how we deal with parking. And so starting tomorrow at 9 a.m., we're really going to talk about facilitating parking for livable centers. So how do we develop the live, work, play communities that we want to see as advocates for livable centers? But what are the things we need to consider? So we're actually going to take a dive one step further, and we're going to get into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts when we think about parking. So tomorrow at 9 a.m., we will have our welcome and introductions. We ask you to join us. And we're going to dive into the discussion of parking trends, understand what are the opportunities and misconceptions, especially as when you think about it from a municipal lens. And then we're going to identify our needs and our tools. And so we're actually going to think about it from a private developer side. So what does the private side think about when they're thinking about investment? And then on the flip side, what does a municipality think about when they're thinking about parking, and how do those two things play? We heard a little bit of that conversation tonight. And then finally, we will have a conversation about the actual utilization of parking tools. So we are going to dive into 4 case studies, 3 which are in our region and 1 which is just outside of our region in Bryan College Station. And we're going to look at case studies where folks really are doing things differently in our region to accommodate things like shared use parking, for example. We will hear from the community of Tomball, the community of Sugar Land, and then we're going to dive into it with our Midtown tours. So if these are things you're interested in, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning. Again, if you have not registered, we ask you to do that now. And with that, I have asked all my panelists and Mike Burns to make sure that this was really meant to be a relaxed environment. We really enjoy everybody being here. So I'm going to raise my glass to our panelists, and they can do so as well. And for those of you listening, have a wonderful evening, and we will see you tomorrow morning.